We spoke about Sinema and Manchin high-fiving each other over, the lack of filibuster reform, and they were sitting on a panel with Chris Coons as well. And I mean, how much was your sense of their being there a sort of like just strictly a fundraising issue for them? Because really, more than any other senators in the Senate, they were inhibiting the most worker empowering agendas that could have been there. Like, the Build Back Better in particular would have really, I think, strengthened workers in many ways. Things like parental leave, paid sick leave, child tax credit extension. I mean, all of these things that commodify different parts of our lives, strengthen workers because they're not threatened with their kids having no health insurance, or they have more money in the bank, or they have mandated paid sick leave and parental leave. How much of like what they're there for is your sense is like they're just fundraising because they've lost on some level these are their constituents?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. If you look at both Manchin's numbers in West Virginia, they are cratering. They're disastrously bad. And Sinema's numbers are very bad among her own party as well. Ruben Gallego, progressive Democratic representative, just announced his campaign for Senate, in which he'll be running against Sinema. So, having lost a lot of people power for their positions that were amenable to corporate interests in the context of the entire last congressional session, their only move at this point is just to grab as much money as they possibly can from these corporate donors that are going to see an image like them high-fiving, and I suppose people like us getting angry about it and say, wow, this person's really must be on our side. We better, give them a bunch of money. And if you look at the amount of money that, I can't remember what the group is, I think it's called Third Way, has raised for Sinema, it's really extraordinary. So it's I wouldn't necessarily look at the sort of dire polling picture and necessarily assume that they're not going to be able to at least mitigate that with just this flood of corporate cash that they have going to their coffers because of their conduct over the last 2 years.
At the very least, that's their strategy. I mean, we can't anticipate how well it's going to work. And I think you're right. I think it's, you put in $50-100 million worth of ads, that she's going to be able to start running now for the next 2 years. That's definitely going to help her. And at the very least, it's going to put a scare into the Democrats that they're going to split the vote. But I don't know. Gallego came out, that opening video he did to announce his campaign is pretty impressive. So we'll see about that. Let's talk about this idea about protectionism that came up, and the idea of bringing back jobs. It was interesting because when Chris Coons is the voice of reason, you got a problem.
Yeah, he was sort of the dove in this meeting, which was sort of extraordinary.
Yeah, tell us about it.
Okay, so I'll just read you a quote. One of the president of the World Economic Forum, which organizes Davos, Borje Brende, I don't know if I'm saying it right. He said, quote, "If we get too much into this notion of friendshoring or more protectionist measures, we can shave off a lot of growth globally." And just his tone at that point was kind of like, oh God, like that, we can't let that happen. And so he says, how far will the US go in friendshoring? I'll explain that in a second, making sure that things go to Mexico and countries that you're allied with. And so he's trying to take the temperature of Coons as a Democratic US senator, get a sense from him what the chamber is going to do over the next 2 years in this regard. So protectionism.
And we should also say Coons is probably the closest to Biden in the Senate of any other senator. I mean, he was like on the trail surrogate for him. They are very close.
Yeah. So protectionism is kind of the opposite of free trade. It's the idea that you're going to protect domestic industry with tariffs on foreign imports and things. Basically, the idea being so that you can have industry in your own country, so you're not having to import, slave labor products from China or whatever. In its best case. And then the sort of counter argument to that is, we need to have open markets and trade with other countries and everything. And so friendshoring is the idea that not just are you going to bring production back to the US, but that you would bring production back to your region, so neighboring countries. And over the course of this panel, they explicitly say, Coons points out, if we friendshore, bring jobs back to El Salvador, Mexico, Honduras, so on and so forth, not only will that, have a positive effect on the US economy, that's going to decrease the economic crisis that they're experiencing there. And that's going to decrease the sort of undocumented migration that the right wing claims to care so much about, because people will actually be able to stay in those countries and not have to, flee potentially violence or horrible economic situations. And it was just amazing to me to see the amount of awareness that Coons had about these things. He said, quote, the reach and scope of globalization that have caused a backlash in many of our countries, a populist backlash, certainly in the United States, needs to be addressed. So to me, that sounds like he's saying political extremism is connected to the economic environment that our free trade apparatus has created. So I think, oh wow, that's a big admission. So is he going to be for protectionism? And then he goes on to say, nearshoring would improve the job opportunities in Central America, but ultimately, he says, I don't think the changes will be as robust as people are projecting. And he says, we will continue to have an open economy, to be committed to free trade, and see the robust value that globalization has brought to the world, as well as to many of our people. So it's kind of like, here's all the great things of protectionism, but yeah, we're not doing it.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting tension here because, one, the COVID made it clear that that from a logistics standpoint, we need shorter supply lines for some key things, right? We can't rely on all these things coming from China. And everything about, sort of like bringing jobs back to Central America will ease the situation for people there. And presumably there's other issues too, but presumably make it easier, make the lives of people easier there, and will diminish the pressure of immigrants coming north. But the other issue here is that in fully sort of divesting on some level from China, we're also setting up a conflict with China because we have decoupled our fates from each other. And this is one of the things that, sort of the line that it feels like Biden is walking here, and it's unclear on which side of it he's falling, because the thing that has always sort of like maintained, I guess, the lack of aggression between us and China was that we're screwed if China's screwed, and China's screwed if we're screwed. Right. But if we decouple that sort of fate from each other, that it makes, sort of like an actual conflict more possible. So it's interesting to see how they're talking around these things. But that takes us to Henry Kissinger speaking on peace. I mean,
what do you say?
Sam's doing a talk later on why floral scents are really good. And being all.
I mean, this is. Was this like this entertainment? Like they couldn't get the comedian they wanted for that night, and so they just brought this sketch in, or what?
Well, and you said before that there's an element of networking here, and the amount of just bootlicking. I mean, I expect that watching something like this, but this stuff surprised even me. So to give you the quote, it's not just the thing is called the title of the event had the words war and peace in it, but if you look at the comments, it was just so ingratiating. So he says, quote, the moderator, who's a Harvard professor of government, says to Kissinger, you've drilled down deeper on the challenges of war and peace than any other person I can identify. Which I had to pause because it's like that's one way to put it. And then he goes on to say,
he's half right?
Well,
the war part.
Well, he's right about the peace thing. It's just that he's drilled down and then undermined it. I mean, so he really knows what could bring about peace. He just decided we're not going to go in that direction.
Mm.
Right. He goes on to say, Kissinger has continued thinking in the time since the Vietnam War, has continued thinking and writing about the challenges of building a peaceful world order, which is just a turn of phrase I dearly loved.
Yeah. And what did Kissinger have to say? I mean, the guy's old.
100 years, 99, 100 years old?
It was just a lot of pablum. I thought Noam Chomsky put it well when he said he seems like a sort of mid-level manager that was able to conceal his vacuity with pretentious verbiage. That was exactly what this entire talk was, and some backing off of previous remarks that he had made on the need to negotiate with Russia on Ukraine and apologize and saying, no, I support this war, blah, blah, blah. So that was sort of the extent of the insight from Mr. Kissinger.
I just the idea that guy lives to 99 is really.
I mean, how are him and Dick Cheney still kicking? Dick Cheney.
They're gonna outlive all of us.
I know.
Yeah, they're gonna be like head in a jar, and we'll all be gone.
Oh,
if you ever wanted proof that there is no God, there it is. And then the last one, it seems like all has been forgiven in terms of Saudi Arabia. I mean, I guess that's the nothing like a tightening of the world's oil supply to put Saudi Arabia back in everyone's good graces.
Yeah, it was interesting. Even some in the mainstream were sort of laughing at how ridiculous this was. It was political reporter Alex Ward called it, quote, this is basically an infomercial for Saudi Arabia, which is not an exaggeration at all. So the the event was called Saudi Arabia's Transformation in a Changing Global Context. And the entire thing is just a tongue washing of this plan that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who the CIA says ordered the killing of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi, he has this political plan called Vision 2030, which remains largely a vision. It hasn't really been realized despite the last several years of his, endlessly talking about this. But in that vision, the idea is essentially we're going to develop this country so that it's not just a gas station. And, I don't think there's much evidence for that. Any of that has happened, but the entire panel is, I think it's a top IMF official talking about how wonderful this plan is. The head of a think tank called the Atlantic Council, which here in Washington is a very powerful think tank in terms of formulating the kind of private consensus on foreign policy. The head of that think tank, Fred Kemp, he just at the beginning of the entire thing, he calls Saudi Arabia's Minister of Finance, who's also president, a quote rock star, and he says, I hope that's an accepted thing to call someone in Saudi Arabia, but you really are so highly respected. You really are very respected by all of your peers. I mean, it was just, and then it cuts to the Minister of Finance just beaming. It was disgusting. The entire thing is like this. And at the same time, sort of humorous thing happening, this head of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp, he had written an op-ed for CNBC defending, this is true, the UN's climate summit chief they put in charge of the next COP 23 climate summit, the CEO of the UAE's state oil company. So this is one of the biggest oil producers on the earth. Their state oil company is now in charge of the UN's climate summit. And the head of the Atlantic Council was in this op-ed saying how that's fine and there's no problem and these activists need to shut up because it's really not that big of a deal. At the exact same time that this conference is happening, CNBC has to append an update talking about his conflicts of interest with these oil countries because the Atlantic Council gets so much money from them, just to give viewers a sense of the context in which Fred Kemp is speaking here. Wow.
And we should say, too, that I think that, it just shows you, Thomas Friedman still, in many ways, rules our world. Because I still remember when he was just praising MBS for all of the progressive things he was doing with Saudi Arabia. Women have driver's licenses now, and that was, I guess that was, I don't know, 7-8 years ago now, but it all comes back around. It seems like they have won out.